momentarily my CNN colleague Elie Honig to talk about Tren de Agua and this controversy surrounding the deportation of these presumed gang members to El Salvador. I want to frame, however, the question before I say hello to Elie. Yesterday's poll result at Smerconish.com, one of the closest that we've had in quite some time, 32,000 plus voted. Which should be the Democratic priority? Collaboration with Republicans so as to influence legislation or blocking the GOP agenda? 50.29% to 49.71%. It hardly matters which was which. So an even divide. But I will tell you that the blocking component of the vote was 50.29%. Okay? 50.29% said, hey, Democrats, you ought to be blocking Trump at every juncture. I wanted to make that my poll question so as to do a comparison, because that was just asked by CNN in a much more scientific means, and their number was 57% who said block. Interesting that our audience has more individuals of a mindset that says Democrats ought to try and get, half a loaf if they can, maybe a quarter a loaf out of Donald Trump. What's really interesting is that if you go back to 2017, when that same question was asked early on in Trump 1.0, 74% were saying, hey, Democrats, try and work with this guy. So that has changed. Okay, so there's that. Metric number 2, Doug Sosnick was here yesterday. Anytime he puts out one of his missives, they are read very carefully by those who follow these matters as closely as we all do. Among the data presentation that he made here yesterday, he had a slide that said that on all the major issues, there's only one where Donald Trump is above water, and it's immigration. 51% approval on immigration, tariffs, foreign affairs, healthcare policy, the economy, his job as president, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. He's now underwater, meaning more regard his handling of that specific issue unfavorably than favorably. Exception, immigration. Then additional poll data, we went through it yesterday. There is an all-time low in terms of the perception of the Democratic Party. This is according to CNN's data. Among American public members overall, the Democratic Party's favorability stands at just 29%, a record low in CNN's polling dating back to 1992. So with that in mind, Trump's strongest issue is immigration. Democrats are perceived as being in disarray. Two interesting stories, both in the newsletter today. They're both in the realm of immigration. One involves a Brown doctor, meaning a Brown University professor and physician. Pictures on her phone, really interesting. Not sure exactly why her phone was being evaluated at Boston's Logan Airport, but it was. She had photographs on her phone showing ties to Hezbollah and to Iran, and she now finds herself subject to deportation. She apparently went to the funeral for Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah. You'll remember that the Israelis took out Hassan Nasrallah, the so-called spiritual leader, in an Israeli airstrike in Beirut. So that's interesting. We should keep our eyes on it. I'm sure the response from some will be to say, good riddance if, that was her political path. I maintain we should all be concerned about these matters of civil liberties. I'll get to that with Elie Honig in just a moment. And of course, the big story today is the deportation of over 200 presumed members of this Venezuelan gang, Tren de Agua. We're not sending them to Venezuela. We're sending them to El Salvador. I'm sure you've seen the images, the video of this Max facility. I watched an incredible CNN report on it last night showing they have a capacity, I think, of 40,000. It's like a football stadium full of prisoners, and you've seen them all dressed in the same way, all, it seems, heavily tatted. They get only 30 minutes outside their cell each and every day. The most rigid of conditions. And the Trump administration seems to have violated, run afoul of, ignored a federal order from a district court judge. His name is Boasberg, who said, stop the planes and bring them back. But they didn't do so. The poll question, which I'll get to after I walk through some of the facts with Elie, asks, who wins politically in this battle? Is it Trump or is it his political opponents? To me, it's a no-brainer. He violated the law and has strengthened his hand in the process. CNN's senior legal analyst is Elie Honig. He has written on this case. His essay is contained in today's newsletter by virtue of New York Mag, and he writes under the headline that Donald Trump is playing a quote-unquote dangerous game. Elie, thank you so much for your time. I know how in demand you are on a day like today, especially where there'll be more on this case that'll be forthcoming. Walk me through the law first, if you don't, take us back to the 18th century.
So, Michael, the Trump administration here is relying on a very old law from 1798 called the Alien Enemies Act. And that law gives the president basically very broad powers to deport non-citizens. So to be clear, we're not talking about people who are citizens. This only would apply to people who are here illegally, people who are here with visas, or LPRs, legal permanent green card holders. The president can deport those people if he makes one of two findings. One, we are in a state of declared war with a foreign country. Obviously, that's not the case. And the second one, the one that Trump administration is relying on, is if you have a hostile invasion or incursion, that's sort of part A, and then part B is by a foreign government. Now, we know what the Trump administration's position is, and I say in the article that you mentioned, Michael, that this feels like a stretch because the president issued an official proclamation to this effect over the weekend. Basically, he argues, well, the presence of these gang members, Trendiagua gang members here in the United States, is essentially the same as a, quote, invasion. And then the second part that the Trump administration claims is, and they are acting in alignment with or somehow in concert with the official government, because they have to make that showing, of Venezuela. So that's the merits argument that's going to play out in the courts. And it's important to note that's separate from the whole dispute over whether the administration has defied the judge's order.
Okay, and that issue has already reached a district court. Tell me about those proceedings.
Yeah, so this is in front of a district court judge, which is the trial court in Washington, D.C., as you said, James Boasberg. There was a lot of action really quickly that happened this weekend. So the judge basically said, we're going to have a hearing on Saturday. And on Saturday, the judge has the parties in, DOJ, and then the parties who are opposing the deportation. And at precisely 6:47 p.m. on Saturday, the judge issues an oral ruling from the bench, part of which he says to the government, to the Trump administration lawyers, you need to keep any planes grounded and get any planes that are in the air turned around. Now, it turns out that those planes were not turned around, that all these folks, all these gang members were actually deported. And the judge then basically said, and many in the media said, whoa, did the Trump administration defy the specific order of this judge? And what the judge has now demanded, and we're going to see this in 2 hours and 48 minutes from now, by noon today, DOJ has to essentially submit a TikTok saying, where were these planes at each moment as relevant to the orders I gave you in court? And it's really important. The biggest thing that happened yesterday, Michael, to me is it was unclear what the Trump administration's response was going to be. If you listen to some of the louder, more aggressive voices out there, it sounded almost like the Trump administration was going to go into court yesterday and say, you're darn right we defied you, Judge Boasberg, and we're going to keep defying you. That's not the actual position of the administration. To the contrary, their position is, we have no intent to defy you. We don't believe we defied you. We may have had a communications lapse in conveying your order, and we disagree on when the order was sort of effective. But I think that's, if you're upset by this, and I find plenty of reason to be worried, a silver lining, at least, is that the Trump administration is not endorsing or celebrating defiance of a judge's order.
Notwithstanding that, I saw Tom Homan say, I don't care what the judges say.
Yeah, so let's make sure to draw a distinction between the Tom Homans and other loud voices out there on social media and elsewhere who are, flexing their muscles and to heck with the judge and we do what we want. That is not actually the Trump administration's position. In this case that we're talking about, Michael, in the case you mentioned relating to the surgeon with Brown University, both of those cases, the administration's position is essentially, we don't believe we have defied you, different judges. It was never our intent to defy you. Now, they're playing very fast and loose. I think what they may have been, what I call in the article, intentionally reckless and maybe intentionally a little bit slow playing in transmitting the judge's orders. But the rhetoric you're hearing from Tom Homan and others is quite different from what the actual position is.
Elie, in your piece for New York Magazine, quote, "The Washington Post has constructed the most complete timeline available so far. It shows that at the moment the judge gave his order orally from the bench, 6:47 p.m. on Saturday, 2 of 3 flights were already in the air, and the third was on the ground. When the judge's written order hit the docket at 7:26 p.m., the status of all 3 flights was the same as before, 2 in the air, 1 on the ground, though that third flight left 10 minutes later at 7:36. Flight number 3 is a big problem for the administration, no?"
It is because, there's been a little bit of quibbling over which governs. When the judge said from the bench orally at 6:47, keep those planes grounded and turn them around, or the administration argued, I think, very lamely, well, it's not really the oral order, it's really the written order, which came out at 7:26. First of all, let me just tell you, if you've ever made a living appearing in front of federal judges, that is a ridiculous position to take. I mean, I cringed when I heard them say that. I'm thinking back of all the federal judges who looked at me and said, "Here's your order." Even if it wasn't reflected in the written order, your job here as a lawyer, especially DOJ, is not to play gotcha. Oh, you said this to me in court, but you didn't write it in the order. That holds no water. But either way you cut this, there was a plane on the ground that took off 10 minutes after the written order came down. And now, look, I think it's reasonable to give DOJ a couple moments to transmit the orders. As I say in the piece, we have cell phones now, though. It doesn't need to be conveyed by Pony Express. But this all gets to the point I made about intentional recklessness. If you were a good faith player, if you were trying to do the right thing, the DOJ, I knew. Here's what the approach would be. Okay, we have this hearing in front of the judge Saturday afternoon. We don't know what he's going to do. There's a realistic chance he might want to put a pause on this. So let's just wait. Let's see what he says, and then we'll act accordingly. Instead, what the Trump administration did is say, well, let's load up the planes. We'll put them all in the planes. We'll fuel up the planes. We'll have them taxiing. Maybe someone will be in the air. Maybe someone will be about to go in the air. And then if it takes us a moment to transmit things or not, maybe it'll be too late by then.
What is the argument? Make the argument in short form. The best case of the Trump administration that they can litigate as this thing proceeds. If you were tasked, Elie Honig, with making their case, what would it be, notwithstanding the 18th century law that you've cited, which seems they're on the wrong side of?
Yeah, so they're going to have 2 arguments when we get to the merits. The first one, and there was a very interesting interview you may have seen at the Casey Hunt did yesterday with Stephen Miller, and he kept yelling this. Yeah, he kept saying, it's not, he used the word justiciable, right? And he was saying it in a very aggressive, sort of garbled manner. But there is a genuine legal argument that says you, the courts, do not have the power, do not have the jurisdiction to get involved in this. This power to decide whether the Alien Enemies Act applies is solely for the president. And by the way, courts do sometimes find that something is non-justiciable. Courts do sometimes say, you know what, this is not something we are allowed to decide. Now, my problem with Steve Miller is he seemed to think it's good enough to say, well, we've decided it's non-justiciable, therefore the courts don't get to decide. It's like, well, that's not up to you, Stephen Miller. That's up to the courts. But that's a potent argument. And there is U.S. Supreme Court precedent in cases very similar to this, where the court has said basically, no, when it comes to the president applying immigration laws, that's really for him. And it's not for us to second guess that. So that's argument one. That's, I think, the best legal argument. I think the other argument about the gang is actually an invasion, and even though they're a gang, they're kind of acting on behalf of the government.
Right.
It's not just one stretch; it's 2 stretches. So
okay, on your first argument, I was there that day. It was as a 1L that we went over Marbury versus Madison. Isn't this a pretty straightforward case of judicial review?
Well, but right. So Marbury versus Madison is the case that basically gave the courts the right and the power, the courts gave themselves, I guess, because it was the Supreme Court, to review executive and congressional action. But that doesn't mean that they always will review. I mean, there are plenty of cases where the courts say, yes, we have the right and the power in many circumstances to review something the president's done or Congress has done. But there are plenty of times when we abstain. It's called abstention doctrine, right? We don't think this is for us. We don't think we have jurisdiction. We think this is a, quote, political question. So that, I think, it's almost a procedural argument of sorts. But think about this Supreme Court, right? That they're conservative. They certainly are, the 6 conservatives are certainly believers in strong executive power. And to hear them say it in judicial restraint. So I don't think those two things are inconsistent.
So can we agree that it doesn't, no matter what happens later today, it doesn't end today, right?
For sure.
So if
today,
go ahead.
Today, what we're going to learn is, did the administration knowingly and intentionally defy this judge's order? Their position is no, we did not. We'll see how that sort of plays out. And then two, alternatively, how sloppy was the administration in giving effect to the judge's order? How much time did it take them to transmit the order from the courthouse out to those planes? And was that an inexcusable lapse?
So finally, I'm going to talk about the politics of this. And I don't know if you want a piece of that or not. My first point is to say, I think we all need to be concerned, as hard as it is to argue for rights for Tren de Agua. You need to be concerned about the violation of a judicial order, because if they'll do it in this instance, in what other instances will they do it? Having said that, and people will, of course, I can tell them, please spare me your calls that say I'm normalizing the president. I'm a realist. I'm saying I believe that Trump is on the wrong side of the 18th century law in this case. Having said that, it puts his political opponents, Elie, in the position of somehow having to litigate for these guys who look like central casting. And I don't know what they're guilty of or not, because they've not had due process. But you've now got to argue for individuals who look like central casting sent us what bad guys should look like.
Yeah, so a couple reactions. First of all, I look at this sort of the way I looked at every criminal defendant who I ever prosecuted, which is I want them out of commission. I want them locked up for the appropriate amount of time, but I want it done right. I never had any interest in getting anyone locked up outside of our rules and our due process. That's point one. Point two, very important distinction to keep in mind with all these immigration controversies. This is an entirely different legal context than the criminal law. We are so used to the criminal process. When you're talking about a criminal case, it is mostly all out there. There's an indictment. It tells you exactly what the allegation is. There's discovery. You have to turn over all your evidence. We usually see that. There's an open and public trial. There are well-established burdens of proof. You have to prove, grand jury by probable cause to a trial jury beyond a reasonable doubt. The immigration world, the laws around immigration are totally different. You don't have indictments. You don't have to, even in many cases, say exactly what you believe they've done wrong. Immigration procedures happen much more under cover of darkness, much less transparency, much less, in some cases, no due process, and much more unilateral power vested in the president. And then finally, as to your poll question and the political angle of it, I agree with you. Look, I have, as you can tell, I have a lot of questions and problems about what the Trump administration has done here legally. But if you look at the politics of this, what are both sides' arguments? The Trump side's argument is they want to turn around that plane full of those scary guys with the tats all over them.
You want them in your neighborhood? Right.
Yep. They want to turn that plane around. The other side's argument is, well, but they defied an order, and maybe it was intentional and maybe it wasn't, and we'll see. Like, which argument's going to resonate more with normal people?
Exactly. Elie, that was an excellent analysis. Thank you for allowing us to intrude on your day. I'm sure we'll watch you all day long on CNN.
Thanks, Michael. Always thrilled to join you.
Hey, by the way, I've served notice to the legal community writ large that we will be together in May for the CLE of all CLEs, and the ABA allows accreditation for the CLE program regardless of what state you're in. So anyone who needs their credit, and we all do, this is the way to get it.
Listen, lawyers, usually the way you get your credits is you have to go to something about like wills, trusts, and estates and the evolution of. This is like me and Michael and Danny. This is like this is a ball.
It's going to be great.
It's going to be great. Out.
Yeah, we're going to do this for 3 or 4 hours. Elie, thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thanks, guys. See you.
Elie's the best. The Wall Street Journal editorialized on this today, and the short version of what the Journal said is that, Trump campaigned on deporting gang members. He told us he was going to do this, and he's doing it. That's a great thing. But he's got to do it by the book, to Elie's point, right? The rules might be different than your conventional criminal process, but still, there are rules, and there was a court order in this case, and Trump is not playing by those rules. So I went to the comments. That's the editorial from the Wall Street Journal. By the way, that's my view. That is my view as well, the way that they expressed it. So I went to the comments of the Wall Street Journal and I watched a ping pong match. One comment. The question should be, why are Democrats fighting so hard to keep criminals in this country? To which someone said, the question is why this administration and citizens like you support fascism and don't defend the constitutional separation of powers. Followed by, when it comes to non-citizens who are in this country illegally, I think the president ought to have substantial discretion on matters related to deportation. Plenty of the things Trump says and does make me nervous, but deporting thugs here illegally isn't one of them. Followed by, all of this is terrifying when you think about it. Straight up dictator stuff. Followed by, yes, unfortunately, we had a 4-year dictator who opened up America's border wide open. Just a few more. We elected Trump to restore common sense. These gang members were here illegally and do not enjoy the same rights as U.S. citizens. They are not welcome here. Keep it up, President Trump. And then, when a judge tells you to do something, if you ignore the judge, you are lawless. That started real fun in the 1930s. And it didn't end so well. Into which of those camps do you fall?